So welcome everyone. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Lucio Valerio Sarandrea, as you can read, and I'm Child Protection Specialist at the UNICEF Office for East Asia and the Pacific region. And it is my real pleasure to open this important event that will present the Manifesto on Good Data and Governance for Children in Asia and Africa. Few words from my side to introduce this discussion. The manifesto is the result of a combined effort of different working groups, actually 17, that are experts in data governance from all over the world, and throughout consultations that really include, from Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. The reason for this manifesto is very deep, because we do understand, and we are trying to understand better, how to deal with the incredible amount of data that we have available, and the great potential and associated with risks that data entail for children. The availability that we are having more and more of data really represents a great opportunity for better protecting children. The examples that you will hear throughout this discussion about the potential in terms of security, health, and the current pandemic is one of the examples that we can easily relate to, is really immense. At the same time, we really need to be mindful on the risk associated with the data and with the management. And I think that today's discussion is very timely, because we are dealing with an issue that is evolving extremely rapidly. And these are all complex issues that require fast answers that we do not have, and we need to find in the shortest possible period of time for the sake of protecting children especially. We will need to find a right balance about state obligations and private obligations, balances that are very difficult to strike. In this context, I am very happy also to report the issuing of the General Comment number 25 of the CRC, of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, that really deals with this issue about the rights of children in the digital environment. It is a very dense general comment that raises lots of questions, and I invite everyone really to read it and use to think about it and trying to find inspiration for those questions that I was relating to before. So without further ado, I think that we can start with an introduction to the manifesto from one of its authors. Then we will then have two presentations from our guests from Digi Malaysia and Code for Africa, followed by a panel discussion led by the Executive Director of Digital Asia Hub, with the same speakers and two additional guests. The first, from Privacy International, will talk about Zimbabwe and Africa more broadly. And the second, an independent attorney that will talk about the Philippines. Having said that, I really wish everyone a fruitful discussion for the sake of increasing the protection and the rights of the children worldwide. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucio. My name's Emma Day. I am a consultant for UNICEF and one of the authors of the manifesto. I'm going to give you a short overview about the manifesto, but before I do that, just some points of housekeeping. You may have noticed that for participants, the cameras and microphones have been disabled. That's just in the interests of time. We have quite a tight schedule today, so we're going to stick to the speakers. You will have an opportunity to participate by putting questions in the Q&A function. Please do make sure your questions go in the Q&A rather than in the chat so that we don't miss them. Also, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat function so that the other participants will be able to see who is here today. And just one other point is that this is being recorded and will be made available, the recording will be made available publicly after the session. So with that, I will turn to an overview of the manifesto. So the reason we're here today is to focus on the implementation of this manifesto in Asia and Africa. One of the issues identified in the manifesto was that the most influential data protection laws in the world come from the US, Europe, and China, with the GDPR being the most dominant globally. And today we'll be asking what that means for the rest of the world and for Asia and Africa in particular. How should countries in Asia and Africa be revising their data protection laws, and what standards should they be following? We found that good global data governance in general is lacking, not just for children. So in the meantime, what should companies operating in Asia and Africa be doing to ensure they're protecting children's data to the highest standards, regardless of national law? The manifesto identified several enablers of good governance of children's data, including policy innovation and improved data literacy amongst children, their parents, governments, and societies. And today we'll be asking our panelists and you, the audience, what's going on already in Asia and Africa that may help better data governance for children, and what else is needed. We'll be hearing from Code for Africa about their work on training children and youth in data literacy and some of the inspiring things that children did with their new skills. So I want to begin by giving you a brief overview of the 10 action points we propose in the manifesto, which have been developed to address the systemic changes that are needed to ensure children's data is used responsibly. So the first 3 action points that you can see on this slide call for the strengthening of norms, standards, and principles, and their proactive and universal implementation. I won't read them all out to you in the interests of time, and I invite you to read the manifesto itself to understand what we mean by each of these in more detail. The first action point says that child-centered governance means that children's rights should be a specific and central element of all international, regional, and national legislation related to data governance. Priority should be given for the best interests of the child and consideration of the child's unique circumstances and evolving capacities. Slide 2, please. For the next 4 action points, call on governments, companies, and civil society to implement norms and standards. Currently, we see the onus is on the child and their advocates to show that their data rights have been breached. And we'd like to see that reversed, so the responsibility is shifted to companies and governments to implement children's rights. We want to see companies producing reports about their data processing and more transparency about the measures they have in place to monitor and track children. We'd also like to see multinational companies applying the highest possible standards of child rights and data protection for children wherever they operate in the world, so that children everywhere receive the same standards of data protection. Importantly, children need to also have readily available avenues of redress for violations of their rights, and children should be engaged and empowered to take more control over their own data. Slide 3, please. The final 3 action points of the manifesto call for the strengthening of what we identified as enablers of good governance of children's data. So this includes policy innovations, which can involve things like regulatory sandboxes and data trusts, as well as improved data literacy among children, parents, and their communities, so that children and their communities can better understand the implications of data processing, and so policymakers are also better informed. Finally, this manifesto calls for increased collaboration between data governance actors internationally. It's crucial that this knowledge transfer is not just from the global north to the global south, but that emerging data governance regimes from all parts of the world that can be usefully applied to children are also considered in global governance regimes. So this is the beginning, not the end, and we hope to see greater involvement of all actors from government, the private sector, the humanitarian and development sectors, civil society, and children themselves and from all parts of the world. Let's make sure that from now, all data governance initiatives include children's rights front and centre. So with that, I'd like to now introduce you to our first speaker for today. So Philip Ling is Head of Sustainability at Digi Communications Malaysia. Philip heads sustainability at Digi Telecommunications and actively leads Digi's Yellow Heart Corporate Sustainability Programme. He's been with Digi for 21 years and the last 10 in sustainability, focusing on ESG, internet safety and digital inclusion, with insights and experience in social innovation, green technologies, sustainability and integrated reporting. He's an industry thought leader advocating and contributing to online social issues such as digital citizenship, cyberbullying and cyber grooming, and has been awarded the CyberSafe Professional of the Year in 2012 and in 2016 by Cybersecurity Malaysia. We're really happy to have you join us today, Philip. Thanks very much. And I will hand over to you to talk about the work that you've been doing with Digi related to children's data governance.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's great to join you today here. So today we'll share a bit about our experience when it comes to good data governance, including with the children community that we serve. Next, please. So a bit about us. You can move to the next slide, please. Yeah. So we are one of the telecommunications provider in Malaysia, and of course we are part of a larger group, which is the Telenor Group. So as you can see, the Telenor Group is in Nordics, in a few countries in Nordics and a few countries in Asia. So predominantly Malaysia, Thailand are very similar markets where we have a lot of young people using data and media communication. Next, please. And for us, we've understood from a very early stage the importance of building trust with customers. So within that overall Digi framework or strategy, besides growth and modernization, an important pillar is responsible business. And of course, this is where we align ourselves to global best practices in ESG, but also where we support the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, of the 17 goals, we've chosen one particular goal to champion, which is SDG 10, reducing inequalities. This is because we understand and we realize that in the digital world, there is a potential risk of large inequality, where those who have it are able to exploit those who don't have it. So here, that's where we look at issues like cyberbullying, cyber grooming. All these are considered inequalities on the internet. Similarly, the internet has the potential to close that gap through e-commerce, through leapfrogging education opportunities, business opportunities, learning opportunities, which is why we've selected SDG 10 to champion. Next, please. So on the next slide, as you can see, our framework for responsible business, these are the 10 areas that we've identified, both as areas in society that we wanted to champion. So here it means inclusion, digital inclusion, advancement of skills, which we call future skills, which is also part of a global partnership that we have with UNICEF, as well as online safety, especially of the vulnerable communities, which includes children, seniors, disabled. And at the bottom, looking at raising standards, you would see that both privacy, as data protection and privacy and security is also a focus. So for us, online safety, data protection and privacy and security forms a triangle where there's a lot of overlaps and there's a lot of things that can be done together to build synergy in those three areas. Those are some things that we wanted to focus on today. If we can move to the next slide, please. Now on the next slide, what you can see, this is what we've done when it comes to data privacy. In Digi, in Malaysia, the Personal Data Protection Act came into effect in 2013, and we implemented it as part of the legal requirements in Malaysia. But if you compare the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act, it's a bit basic if you compare it to GDPR. So GDPR is very much comprehensive when it comes to data protection. But for us, it's a journey that began in Malaysia. And one of the good things is that because we can learn from our counterparts in the Nordics, so we can go beyond the requirements of the PDPA and try to pick up some of the best practices in GDPR for us to use. That's in 2018. We also had a data privacy officer. And interestingly, in 2017, as you can see at the bottom right, we adopted the UNICEF Mobile Operators Child Rights Self-Impact Assessment Toolkit, which is the MOCREA toolkit. For me, as I went through the exercise, it was extremely interesting because then it helped us understand not just human rights, which is one of our pillars, but to look at how do you incorporate child rights as part of the human rights. And of course, as we move forward, there's a lot of areas in privacy that needs to be improved, that needs to be learned as more and more technologies are adopted. So on the right, furthest right, you can see that for us, we believe that in the long run, customers value trust, values transparency, security, and accountability, which is why it's something that we would invest in on the long run. Next, please. Then on the next slide, what you can see here is some of the ways we've tried to adopt some best practices when it comes to privacy and data protection in terms of young people as a community. On your left, you see an infographic. This is one part of a longer series. It's where we take our privacy notice for customers and we've changed it into an infographic that's easy to understand. So we understand that access to information is a right, especially for a child to understand what am I signing up for, what type of services am I getting, and why are you collecting some of this data. So we put it out in a very transparent way, what data is being collected and how we are using the collection. And also we've got our websites where we teach and we try to unpack a lot of jargon when it comes to privacy and such. Then in the middle, we look at empowerment. So this is part of our online child safety. We teach about oversharing on the internet. We teach about when we have weak passwords, when you overshare some of your data. So in that sense, we believe that there's a future risk for young people nowadays as a lot more and more of their personal data goes online. And finally, on the last pillar, you see participate in policy and decision making. So in a public consultation with the Personal Data Commission, one of the areas that we actually brought up to them is to look at a provision on children data processing, which is currently not within the Personal Data Protection Act, but it's something that we also wanted to bring up to say that this is something that we've learned, that the rights of children online is slightly different when it comes to consenting adults. So those are ongoing discussions that we are participating in. And I think next, please. So at the end of the day, for us, we've got a brand promise on the next slide. It's connecting you to what matters most. This is what drives us. And for us, as we talk to more stakeholders, we come to understand that data protection is something that as stakeholders get to understand a bit more, then they started realizing the importance of it. Now, so for us, if we are able to move ahead and to help our customers understand and to tell them that this is something that we are that's important to us also, we believe that this will build long-term affinity between the brand and our customers. Thank you so much. Emma, back to you.
Thanks very much, Philip. That was a really interesting presentation. Really interesting to hear that what Digi have been doing in Malaysia goes beyond the Malaysian national law, the legal requirements, and is looking to GDPR for also some standards to follow, and recognizing that data processing for children, even though maybe the national law doesn't require them to have these extra protections, recognizing that children's ability to consent is different to adults there. So really interesting to see. We're going to move on to the next presentation, but if you have questions that you'd like us to put to Philip when we come to the Q&A section, please do put your questions in the Q&A function and we will come back to ask Philip those questions later. So thank you, Philip. I would like to now move on to our next speaker today. So Trisha, excuse me one moment. So Trisha Govindasamy is Senior Data Product Manager at Code for Africa. She's an award-winning South African scientist specializing in geographic information systems and data science. She works as the Senior Data Product Manager for Africa's largest civic technology and data journalism initiative, Code for Africa. And she manages their data lab, which supports data journalism projects by sourcing data, cleaning and analyzing it, and designing novel data visualization techniques. She's also a coordinator for Africa's largest network of female data scientists, journalists, and technologists, Wana Data, and she creates content and trains on data literacy as part of Academy Africa, one of the continent's largest digital journalism skills initiatives. Very happy to have you here today, Tricia. Thanks very much for joining us. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Emma. Next slide, please. Okay. This map shows the percent of population aged 0 to 19 years per region. Compared to all regions in the world, Africa has the highest percent of youth population compared to its total population. This is followed by Latin America and the Caribbean, then Asia, the Oceania region, North America, and lastly Europe. Let's look at this in more detail. Next slide, please. Half the population in Africa is aged 0 to 19 years. Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean's child or youth population are just over 30% compared to its total population. On the other end, Northern America has just under a quarter of its population within this age group, and Europe has the lowest at 21%. This little exercise tells us many things, but I'd like to highlight a few right away. Firstly, data is extremely important in developing policy and for decision making. Secondly, child populations are much higher in so-called developing nations, while most policies are developed in North America and Europe, which has the lowest percent of child population. This shows us the need for the Governance for Children's Data Manifesto to not only be implemented in Africa and Asia, but also be adapted for the local context. In order to do that, first let's look at some of the challenges with data in Africa. Next slide, please. Firstly, there is generally a lack of data. When COVID-19 hit Africa, countries were unable to even identify how many hospital beds or ventilators they had available. Then, when there is data available, there becomes the problem of anomalizing data in smaller villages. For example, if a small village has 6 children and that are between the ages of, let's say, 10 to 15 years, and 5 of them are female, and the data set indicates that one male child aged 10 to 15 had polio, it then will become quite evident who that child is. Then we have the problem of no open data. Data is very difficult to access. Many data sets aren't available online, and if it is, it's stuck on websites or PDF reports that need to be scraped into a machine-readable format so that we're able to generate insights. Scraping data then becomes a time-consuming and expensive process. You also have a common scenario seen in these 2 pictures. These are the government gazette offices in Kenya and Nigeria. All these hard copy documents you see in broken shelves and under leaking ceilings are government gazettes. Code for Africa has worked on a project to liberate these gazettes by digitizing them and making them available online to the public, all for free. So let's say we lived in an ideal world where all of the above problems didn't exist. We still have the challenge of data literacy. People are quite afraid of numbers and don't know how to find insights from data sets. As part of Code for Africa's Academy Africa initiative, we offer free data literacy trainings. Lastly, I want to touch on the exclusion of people in datasets. When people are excluded from datasets, they are excluded from planning. This was the case of a slum called Makoko in Nigeria. The area was a blank spot on the map, and Code for Africa helped to map the area. Let's look at a short video on the project. Next slide, please.
Going around with a team made up of girls from Makoko to actually collect points of interest within their neighborhood, within their houses, to put this on the map so we can have multi-layers of points of interest on this map. So we can see the streets and have easy navigation, and all of this can be on the map for free.
Having fun, like mapping our community, giving the areas that do not have names, we are giving them like address.
Now, city they go to I just get the middle number 19, number 13, number 14. Number do you know? Who do I need 3 bigger? As I go to the Miwa Catholic, city balance city. Oh, as a go city, a ton of banga, a Balobia Bonimosi.
Slide, please. Census Africa is an initiative within Code for Africa, and they have deployed air quality sensors in schools in South Africa and Kenya. In South Africa, the children were trained on data collection and data literacy using the sensors. In Kenya, the results produced from the sensors indicated that the air quality was so poor that it was similar to a pupil smoking 2 cigarettes a day. This further emphasizes how data can be used to empower children to improve their livelihoods. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks very much, Tricia. So really interesting examples there of how data can be used for good, and also the power of training children and young people in seeing the inspiring things that they can come up with. So this was one of the recommendations of the manifesto to empower children and young people and their communities with more information, to let them have more agency and control over their own data and use it for good in some of these kinds of ways. So thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Philip, for those really interesting presentations. We're going to move on now to the panel discussion section for today. And very happy to welcome to chair the panel today, Malavika Jayaram. She's the inaugural Executive Director of the Digital Asia Hub. Prior to her relocation to Hong Kong and then on to Singapore, she spent 3 years as a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And she's been a faculty affiliate of the center since 2017. She's been a technology lawyer for over 15 years and practiced law at Allen & Overy in London, and was Vice President in Technology Council at Citigroup. So Malavika was also involved in writing of the manifesto. She was part of the working group, so very happy to have her here today. Malavika, welcome, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks to everyone who's made time for this, both to speak as well as to listen. I think it's a really, really important project. I'm very proud to have played a very tiny role in this. If I just sort of step back to how we developed this manifesto, when we were part of the advisory group, I was very keen to participate for two specific reasons. One was, you know, in this part of the world where I am in Asia, we're always trying to tackle new problems. We're trying to use AI to solve everything, put everything on the blockchain as if that's going to sort of leapfrog many stages of developmental gaps and somehow catapult us into a science fiction universe. And I think in that we leave behind unsolved problems, things that have been going on for a long time. Things like a lot of countries in this region don't even have privacy laws, despite the sort of GDPR effect, which might have accelerated the interest of countries in this region to put something into place. There are still huge gaps in terms of policy and regulation. So I think looking at children as a very important demographic was something I was very keen to work with. And I think because issues like consent, agency, autonomy, having the ability to self-determine your digital future, those are really important questions, but they get left behind when you have sort of a digital Maslow's hierarchy of, you know, poverty and food and other things that seem to matter more. Children's rights and particularly digital rights are often left behind. So I was very keen to play a role in this manifesto. And I think the second thing is, as an educator myself, looking at how online learning has hugely impacted children's rights online, and you know how in a post-pandemic universe that's probably going to lead to increased surveillance. I think that was something very important, and the manifesto has some great recommendations that have implications for learning. So I'm very glad to have played a part in this, and thanks to Emma and Linda who stewarded this great group of 17 experts and then involved about 100 experts around the world to sort of tinker with, troubleshoot, engage with the manifesto in different ways. So the document that finally has been published includes the wisdom of the crowd of many villages. So we really hope you engage with the content besides just listening in on this webinar. So to move along to some of the speakers that we have, we've got a real all-star cast. In addition to Philip and Tricia, whom you heard from, we also have Kuda from Privacy International, and we have Rory, who's an independent lawyer from the Philippines. And Emma's going to put their full bios in the chat, so we leave the live time to their actual inputs. Thanks for that, Emma. So if I just move on to Kuda first, I guess the question I have for you is, you know, one of the recommendations in the manifesto is we call for strengthening norms, standards, principles, specifically related to children. And, you know, we call for the proactive implementation of these norms and standards across the world. If we could zero in on Africa in particular, can I ask what the challenges you see when it comes to implementation? And if I may, any solutions that you can think of to overcome these challenges? Thanks very much, Kuda.
Kuda, I think you're on mute.
Okay,
All right.
sorry. Thank you very much, Malavika. Thank you to the UNICEF team for organizing this. It's very important to discuss this as a topic because we, as some of the previous speakers have highlighted, we're seeing a lot of policies developed off the continent of Africa and then exported or sort of then brought into Africa for application or adaptation. And to a certain extent, the manifesto is also one such policy, given the fact that, or realizing the fact that there have been experts also including experts that have worked or lived and experienced life in Africa, and that's a good thing. But the one challenge that we've seen across, especially in the Southern African region and some other parts of the continent, is that there is a difference in the context in which the policy that's drafted. So it's drafted in Europe, North America, in places where there are strong, independent democratic institutions. So when a policy is in place in North America or in Europe, it's more likely that there is a functioning jurisdiction, there's a functioning judicial system in place. There is a functioning set of independent commissions that oversee the rollout and implementation and enforcement of these policies. And there's also a, can I say, higher level of public awareness accompanied by digital literacy. So in those communities or in those societies, there's already a public that is aware of their individual rights, aware of how to claim those individual rights, and aware of the measures and structures that they can turn to have those rights enforced. And we don't always see something similar in African regions and African jurisdictions. So the first challenge will be around that lack of independent institutions, specifically in this case, data protection authorities, which are usually, if existing or in place, are usually appointed and staffed at the pleasure of maybe the president of a specific country. If you look, for example, in places like Kenya, where the DPA that was appointed, there was a bit of sort of like disagreement over who the best candidate was. And then the candidate that was placed had previous experience in government and had close links with the ruling party. So those questions raise, those issues raise questions of independence of the authority. And secondly, there's also the situation of where authorities are set up. There's issues of funding, which affect independence. So this is the case in South Africa, where a data protection authority has been set up, but is failing to get off the ground efficiently, citing, among other issues around resources. So those issues all affect the rollout of policies such as the Manifesto and any other data protection or privacy initiatives. And the other thing is that on top of this, you add the fact that members of the public are not aware. It's really an issue of people saying, well, I've got nothing to hide, so why should I rely on privacy laws or data protection laws? Even if they go through my phone, they'll just maybe find chats of me talking about soccer or talking about a women's club or whatever interest I'm into. So the fact that the public doesn't push for the protection of these rights adds another level of difficulty that makes it harder for the enforcement of these policies. And because the public is not pushing, the government will not obviously not prosecute itself where it fails to live up to the expectations in such principles. So one solution that's easy to roll out, easy in the sense that it's not resource intense, is educating members of the public in their privacy rights and their data protection rights. And once members of the public are able to stand up for their rights or push parliamentarians, for example, for the protection of their rights, then that's one step closer to making sure that these rights are actually protected through policies and mechanisms like the data protection framework.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kuda. I think all the geopolitical angles you've mentioned are really important. And I think, my God, the nothing to hide argument, if I had $1 for every time someone said that to me, I'd be sitting on an island somewhere, not dialing into this webinar. But I think those are all really important points. Thank you so much. If I move to Rory now, Rory, you've been working on children's rights, particularly, with a focus on safety and privacy in the Philippines. Maybe I could ask you to outline what the data governance situation is like in the Philippines, any particular aspects you'd like to highlight for this audience? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Malavika. So in the Philippines, there are a lot of technological gaps, particularly in internet access and digital literacy, that prevent most Filipino children from interacting online. However, as the government, together with private sector, addresses these gaps, especially during the pandemic, we can already observe an increase in the engagement of Filipino children through the internet, particularly for educational use and for entertainment and social media. What this means for data governance is that there is increasing data collected about Filipino children by actors that do not necessarily have the protection of the child's data as a priority. So while Philippine data privacy laws are robust and mostly based on the GDPR, there is still a need to formulate and formalize policies relating to children. I think that a consent-based framework can be problematic, especially with regard to student data, because parents and children are not provided a realistic option. They will give consent because otherwise their children will be excluded from the educational system. So when government and private sector provide learning resources and platforms that interact with children, especially those that create learning profiles and curate activities, more and more individualized data will be collected about children. And there is increasing need to watch out for issues of surveillance of children's activities, jeopardizing children's autonomy through preemptive predictions by advanced but unaudited technological platforms, and related to digital access, is the data of the poor and marginalized even included in the creation of these algorithms? So there really is a need to shift the responsibility of data governance to companies and to the government. And so while the Philippines is addressing digital access, literacy gaps, and internet safety, digital inclusion, I think there is great opportunity for collaboration with the government, technology companies, NGOs, think tanks, parents and guardians, and especially with the participation of children to build a child-centric and context-driven data governance framework.
Thanks, Rory. That was super useful. And I think it leads us up very nicely to go back to Philip and ask him to defend the tech industry to some extent. But I think, I mean, what you mentioned was really important about how we tend to push all the responsibility to exercise, agency over settings around different kinds of consent frameworks onto the people who are least equipped to deal with them, least educated and least autonomous. And I think what you're saying about how companies need to actually step up because they can do this at scale at the platform level, I think that's hugely important. So Philip, you'd already mentioned that there's some way to go for the private sector in this realm. Maybe I could ask you to tell us a little more about how companies can play a role in fully implementing some of the principles of the manifesto.
Yep. Thank you. I think I echo what Rory said, right? In providing our services currently, internet services, of course we collect parental consents, right? But if you dig deeper, usually you realize that the parents who are giving consent really need a lot of awareness and education, right? In fact, a majority of the parents don't even understand what is personal data, what it encompasses, right? And if you look through the forms, it talks about giving consent for the data processor, data subject, data user, and these are jargons that they don't get it, right? And because they want the service, like Roy said, they would just sign off. So it's important for us to understand that if these are our customers, there is a obligation for us to also allow them to understand that as you take a service, example on the internet service, it's a chain, it's a value chain. We are the carrier, but then you have the platforms, the OTTs like the Facebooks and the Instagrams. So there are various levels of data that you are giving out at the various levels. And I think that's important to understand. Today, even when there are customers who, when their phone doesn't work, do they go to the Samsung and the Apple, or do they go to your carrier, or do you go to Facebook? So a lot of customers still are unable to differentiate where the service starts and where the service ends. And of course, further when we talk, we haven't even spoken about data retention and how long we retain your data and consent. So again, it's a journey. I think the journey is mainly about educating customers. What are you truly consenting to? And how long is your consent? And whether you're opting in or opting out, and what are the choices that you have, right? So those are the time when it's both supply and demand, the intention of the operator to explain, and for the patience of the customers to learn and to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I think, you've highlighted how it is really an ecosystem, and there are different points along the ecosystem where interventions can be made. I think that's incredibly useful. If I come back to Tricia now, Tricia, two of the things you said really resonated. One was about how there is also a data for good element, as kids get more empowered and how they can actually govern their own data, there can be super impactful changes that can take place. And I think the second thing was around how the fact that a lot of the young populations actually are in Asia and Africa, not in the countries where these norms are usually framed. So I think if I get you to sort of comment on those 2 points and maybe reflect on how you can harness the energy of this large demographic that we have in the global South towards good outcomes, towards impactful change. It would be really great to hear your thoughts on that.
So firstly, we need children to understand data better. This can be in the form of data literacy camps, but this may not be very accessible to everyone. A more inclusive method would be to include data literacy as part of the school's curriculum. But of course, in order to incorporate data literacy in the school's curriculum, you'll need interest from the education departments to adopt it. Like Philip just mentioned, parents don't understand personal data and a lot of the terms. So teachers, if we want to adopt the curriculum in school, teachers would also need to be trained in data literacy. So schools can then form data clubs and participate with each other in hackathons. So hackathons are just so exciting. It gets me so excited. So they are also referred to as data quests, where children will learn how to use data for good. So they will form teams and use data and technology to solve problems around them. They will be mentored by experts within the industry to shape and ideate their projects. They can also be prize givings for the best solutions. And often some projects end up becoming funded by large organizations. So this gives children a lot of hands-on experience and helps them in choosing future careers. We also need to make an emphasis on encouraging and targeting young girls to participate in such initiatives as they are poorly represented in the field of STEM.
Thank you, Tricia. I think those are all really useful and actually very practical recommendations that you've offered. So thanks so much. I see that there are 2 questions in the chat from our audience, and I'm going to just read them out to see if any of you would like to respond. Otherwise, I'm going to get Emma to respond as someone who helps steward this manifesto. So the first question is on how gender. Oh, I think that question has been answered already. Okay, so the gender divide has already been answered. So maybe one question from Ismail Nafi is whether the presenters could share some best practices and concrete examples to translate the manifesto into action. And I think you've all touched on that a little bit, but if any of you would like to add some more on that, just let me know. And the second one, I read this person as Johnny Depp rather than John Denny. So clearly, you know where my mind is today. But it's his question is, he's sort of calling for a sectoral approach, saying, the 10 points in the manifesto, it would be more readable and accessible if they were sort of clustered, particularly on sectors in which children's data was implicated and collected, education, health, social welfare, etc. So he's saying that would be more useful for practitioners. I wonder if maybe Emma might want to respond on that. And the final one is, the great low-hanging fruits question, saying for enablers, for a region like South Asia, what is low-hanging fruit that we could start with? So would any of the panelists like to respond before I hand over to Emma? Rory, Philip, Tricia, Kuda, anyone?
Maybe I can just feedback a
Sure.
bit on John's question. I agree with John that if you break it down to sector, it makes much more sense. Example, we've done human rights due diligence, but when we did the mobile operator child rights due diligence from UNICEF, we realized there are questions that would have escaped us if we only focus on human rights in general. So same thing in a lot of sectors. If you take a generic framework, you might miss out on some areas that's very particular to your sector. And especially when you want to look at inclusivity and capturing the communities that are more vulnerable. So I totally agree with that.
Anyone else? Kuda, Tricia, Rory? Any thoughts on any of the questions that were raised? Kuda, yeah, please.
Yeah, my suggestion is that there needs, first of all, to be public awareness of what the principles, because the one thing about conversations like this is that they are usually confined to spaces where it's one expert talking to another, or one person with similar knowledge talking to another. We are here because for example, we've got interest. Sorry, we've got interest in this topic. This is probably our work. It's something that we're passionate about. So we in this room, virtual room, actively seek out this information. But now there's need to think about how we can then package this information. I like the suggestion about starting at schools, introducing clubs around privacy and data protection, and then expanding that even to community meetings, community discussions, where privacy and data protection is not spoken about in abstract forms, but it's actually explained in day-to-day examples or day-to-day language that people understand. Things starting with things like there's no free technology-based service. If the service is free, then you're most likely the product. I know that has been said a million times, but it's a good starting point to get people thinking about how their data and information is being monetized and most likely exploited, and just get those conversations going. It doesn't need to be a formal workshop. It doesn't need to be a formal gathering. It can even start in places where people are already coming together, like schools, like social clubs, and even WhatsApp groups and Viber groups, depending on the location.
Yeah. I just want to add on to what Kuda and Philip were saying, that probably a low-hanging fruit would be really moving the discussion from purely an internet safety context into a discussion that addresses more about digital citizenship and digital determination. Because when it comes to our children, really the internet is here to stay. It's becoming more powerful and intertwined with our lives. Children's interaction with technology is inevitable. So that when we talk about these issues, we really need to understand that context is key. Are we talking about young children, 3 to 6 year olds? Are we talking about teens and tweens? Or are we talking about first-time internet users or advanced users? So that when we're discussing these issues, we need to understand and take into account evolving capacities of children, identities of children, and how to empower them to become a member of a thriving internet where they can feel safe and at the same time be who they are and who they want to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love the idea of linking it to digital citizenship. And as you said, like with climate, like with so many other things, the rules that come into place today are things that they are going to feel the effects of much longer than my generation. So I think bottoms up approaches, exactly like Kuda is also mentioning, and I think linking it to the arts, to other kinds of cultural activities, embedding it in lived experiences, rather than just, preaching to the choir, like Kuda was alluding to. I think those are all incredibly important, in hackathons and other kinds of ways to get people to engage, like Tricia was mentioning. I think those are all like the spectrum of options and low-hanging fruit that's available. So thank you all so much for your great suggestions. And I'm going to hand back to Emma I'm very proud we're exactly on time. So for Emma, if she wants to join the dots and connect this back to the manifesto and wrap up this conversation. And thank you all for playing a huge role in this great important discussion today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for excellent chairing there, Malavika, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think that we could talk about this for hours, and it's quite hard to do a wrap up in a couple of minutes, really, but I would like to invite people to read the full manifesto. So it's sort of in two parts. The first part looks at what the main issues are that we're concerned about in terms of data processing for children, things like surveillance, by governments, by the private sector, different types of exploitation of children's data and how it's connected to different human rights issues. And then the second part is the recommendations, which is sort of what we call the manifesto. And some of the things that the speakers were talking about do touch on some of those action points. So, for example, Philip talks about the meaning of consent for children, and that's one of the things that we suggest in action point 9 of the manifesto that should be elaborated on. There is a need for further interrogation and principles to really unpack what consent to data processing means for children and children of different age groups, and how we can actually put that into practice in a meaningful way. Some of these questions the world is grappling with, so we definitely don't have answers to everything yet. Hopefully sometime in the future, all of us can work together to solve some of these problems. Also the need for involvement of people from the region, that from Africa, from Asia, from regions, Latin America, regions that are outside of the global north, where a lot of the decision making is currently going on. And one of the things action point 10 calls for is for learning, not just a delivery of information from the global north to the global south, but for true collaboration and learning back and forth of good examples. I definitely take the point that it would be great to have by sector. I think it's something that definitely we will be looking at for the future, how to do deep dives into different sectors. So our starting point really was looking at the landscape of global data governance for everyone, realizing that there's a lot of work to be done for adults as well, and then trying to say, well, how do children's rights sit within this need for better global governance for everyone? And one of our key takeaways is there are efforts at the moment to improve global data governance. So please include children in those. Children are not a side issue. We need them to be included in all efforts towards data governance globally. And this is not something just for UNICEF to solve. This is something that everyone needs to be included in, and we need people from all parts of the world. And we would be really interested if you have good practice examples from your own regions, then we would like to hear about them. And it's something we will be working on going forwards. But this is just the beginning. And so everyone needs to take on this challenge for this new era of technology that we've moved into. And we would like to work with all of you on that. Malavika has put a final parting shot that children are often weaponized as a reason to justify greater surveillance. So yes, we do want to shift that narrative. There's a divide currently between child rights activists and data governance activists. And we want to make sure data governance activists start talking about children, and that child rights activists also talk more about data governance, and we can bridge that divide, hopefully, going forwards. So I think we are at time. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining, and please do get in touch with us if you are interested in this and want to work with us going forward. All right, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.